He walked into the woods he had known his entire life and never came back. He wasn't running. There was no panic, no argument. He simply left for a walk. And that's what makes the story so difficult to explain. It was a quiet spring afternoon in 2008 in Woodland Park, Colorado. An 18-year-old told his family he was going for a walk. That was it. He had grown up around those woods. He knew the trails, the terrain, the way the land shifted as the sun disappeared behind the trees. This wasn't unfamiliar ground. At first, nothing felt urgent. When evening came and he still wasn't home, there were reasonable explanations. Maybe he'd lost track of time. Maybe he'd stopped to talk to someone. Maybe he'd taken a longer route than planned. But as daylight faded completely, the tone shifted. By morning, concern had turned into action. Calls were made, friends were contacted, trails were checked, and then search teams were organized. Volunteers moved into the surrounding forest in coordinated lines. Law enforcement combed through brush, trails, and clearings. His name echoed through the stretches of trees that gave nothing back. The terrain wasn't extreme. No cliffs, no dangerous rivers, nothing that immediately suggested a fatal accident. What made it worse was the absence of anything at all. No torn clothing caught on branches, no footprints that abruptly stopped, no phone, no wallet, just woods. Days passed. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned from above. Areas were retraced, then expanded. Each sweep ended the same way. Nothing. It slowly stopped feeling like a rescue effort and started feeling like something else. As months passed, organized searches slowed, not because people stopped caring, but because urgency has a limit. Flyers remained, conversations continued, but the forest returned to its natural rhythm. Seasons shifted, snow fell, melted. Life in town moved forward, in that uncomfortable way it does when something unresolved lingers underneath it. Years passed, 7 of them, and eventually, people stopped expecting answers. In 2015, a man purchased an abandoned cabin not far from where the young man had last been seen. It had been sitting unused for years. Weather had grayed the siding, the windows were dusty, partially boarded, isolated enough that most people barely noticed it. The new owner planned to demolish it, but when he stepped inside, nothing seemed remarkable. Stale air, debris on the floor, weak light pushing through the dirty glass. Exactly what you'd expect from a building left alone. Then he noticed something. An odor. Not overwhelming, not immediate, just persistent enough to make him stop. He followed the smell to the fireplace. The cabin's stone chimney ran straight up through the ceiling. Old, solid, narrow. When he leaned closer and looked into the dark shaft, he saw something that didn't belong there. Fabric. And it was too high to have simply fallen. At first, it didn't register as significant. It could have been insulation, debris caught on a rough brick, but it wasn't random. It was positioned. Authorities were called. When investigators arrived, they initially assumed it was an animal carcass lodged inside. That would have explained the odor. But as sections of the chimney were dismantled, brick by brick, the assumption collapsed. Inside the narrow vertical shaft were human remains, wedged tightly, upside down. The space was so constricted that removing the body required breaking apart the surrounding structure. There was no room to maneuver. And as more was exposed, certain details stood out. He was wearing only a thin thermal shirt, no jeans, no shoes, no jacket. Those items were later found inside the cabin, not scattered, not torn, neatly placed. And that detail changes everything. Because if he removed his clothing inside the cabin, that means he had already been inside, which leads to the question that has never been clearly answered. If he was already inside, why climb onto the roof and attempt to come back down through the chimney? Investigators theorized he may have broken in through a window, removed his outer layers, and later attempted to exit, then re-enter from above. But that explanation relies on several assumptions. There was also a heavy piece of furniture positioned in front of the fireplace. It had to be moved before the chimney could be dismantled, which means at some point the fireplace had been intentionally blocked. Exactly when and by whom was never established. Officially, the ruling was accidental death. He entered from above, he became wedged, he could not free himself. There was no definitive trauma suggesting assault, no confirmed evidence of another person. Investigators demonstrated that it was physically possible for him to fit inside that chimney, and with that, the case was closed. But possible is not the same as proven. 7 years passed before anyone looked inside that cabin. 7 years of searches expanded outward, while the answer remained less than a mile away. By the time he was found, whatever happened inside that structure had long since gone silent. No witnesses, no preserved timeline, no way to test what truly occurred in those final moments. Just brick, a vertical shaft, and a reconstruction built on assumption. His name was Joshua Maddox. The official explanation tells you how he could have ended up there. It does not tell you why, and it does not tell you whether he was alone. It only tells you that, when he was finally found, he was trapped in a space no one thought to look. For 7 years, he was less than a mile away, and beneath the white pines of Woodland Park, some questions remain.